It's very interesting when NASA announced that it would be shutting down the shuttle program. It was interesting because there was no viable replacement for the shuttle program. This is a program that's gone on for approximately 30 years. There were originally 6 shuttles, I believe. We lost 2 of them due to accidents, along with 2 disasters, and 14 astronauts were killed in accidents. And the Challenger, as people are aware of, and the other one. And 4 shuttles remain, and those are the ones they've been using for the last few years. And, some of the public regions included say, well, we've had 2 disasters. The shuttles are not very safe. There were many close calls. There were poor to no emergency escape methods for the shuttles. I mean, the earlier capsules, the Mercury capsule and some of the others early on, the Apollo missions had escape methods so the astronauts could escape if there were problems. But basically, the shuttle does not have that capability. And, of course, the reason they always sort of fall back on is they were very expensive, incredibly expensive, actually, when you look at it. Approximately 450, I've seen various numbers, but the last number I saw was $450 million per launch and whatever else. And considering there were typically 7 astronauts, shuttle could take a couple more, but 7 was sort of a typical crew load. 7 to $450 million is a lot of money per astronaut to get them up there. So that's definitely part of the problem. And the other excuse that's often given, or reason, is that we need the money that's going into the present shuttle program to develop more advanced systems and cheaper shuttles. NASA, quote, has been working on an Orion spacecraft, which is not, there have been no, at least public launches of this that I'm aware of. And so it sort of goes on. Meanwhile, they've turned delivery services over to the Russians, and we pay them. Interesting turn of events over the many decades that we've watched the space program. So with that background, one sort of scratches their head saying, they've had this thing, they've known they're going to run out of these things for 30 years since they initially built them. The technology is all, what has NASA been doing, and why hasn't it developed something to replace it in time or in good time? The answer, as you will hear from the program, is they and others have. As somebody noted recently about this topic, those folks that have the technologies don't like to have other people play in their sandbox.
I have had the opportunity and honor to interview now hundreds of people who've worked in classified programs, and many of the people who worked in these programs who had some knowledge of the secret space program, very high-tech electromagnetic-gravitic and so-called anti-gravity type systems, which began to be really studied full bore in the 40s and 50s, and by the late 50s were developed. We really thought that at some point we would transition out of these explosive things that are really like a Roman candle with a bunch of guys sitting on it being shot off into space at 25,000 miles per hour. And basically it's a controlled bomb that they're sitting on, which is why there's been so much loss of life. It's not that there's no science behind it, but it's just inherently dangerous. And I want to remind people that the rocket was invented by Wernher von Braun, and this was, of course, in the early 40s when he developed the V-2 rocket for Adolf Hitler. And the basic rocket technology of that era is with some refinements, is what we're still using today, some 70 years later. Meanwhile, the big breakthroughs that have happened in propulsion and energy in the 40s and 50s and 60s that deal with zero-point energy, so-called anti-gravity propulsion systems, gravity control, these have all been kept secret and have gone into what are called black project, or the proper term is unacknowledged projects. And so that there is sort of this this farce where we have 2 space programs. We have a secret space program where you have really top secret operations that go on with Northrop Grumman and Lockheed Skunk Works and some of these other high-tech corporations, Science Applications International Corporation, SAIC, MITRE Corporation, and others. And then you have what the public is told about. And unfortunately, like so many things, we've spent hundreds of billions of dollars over the years on these sort of antiquated circa 1940s rocket technologies when there has been already developed with our tax money these other classified and secret technologies. And not only has there been an enormous waste of money from the public treasury, but there's the waste of not only treasure but blood, and that is the loss of life of these heroic men and women who've gone up into space where there have been these tragedies, such as Challenger. This was a completely avoidable situation and is, frankly, shocking and outrageous. And I think that what we're seeing now is that there were many people who have come to me who worked in these projects in the 60s. And I'm thinking now of a guy who held many top secret clearances and compartments, who in the 50s and early 60s and up through the Apollo era, worked for virtually every contractor back then. Hughes Aerospace, Lockheed. He actually had worked alongside Wernher von Braun in developing the Saturn rocket. And he at one point confronted Wernher von Braun and said, look, why don't we shelve this giant explosive rocket and bring out these other technologies that deal with these very high voltage anti-gravity systems, what the public would call flying saucers, that some of which, of course, are from other civilizations in space that people have seen, but many of them are man-made and are, in fact, part of a secret space program. And he said that Wernher von Braun pulled him inside and said, we will never speak of this again. And what was interesting about that is that this particular scientist, and I have seen his credentials, his badges, this man is for real. The problem, and he's a genius, the problem is that that was over 40 years ago that conversation happened, almost 50. And so when you look at this, it's really a shame. But he told me that when I first met this gentleman in the 1990s, he says, well, we all thought that, okay, we're going to, there'll be a delay, like there are on many classified technologies. Eventually, these new technologies and new sciences will come out, and we'll transition into them. And so the 60s came and went, the 70s came and went, the 80s came and went, the 90s came and went, the 2000s came and went, and they never transitioned out these other technologies. They kept wanting to keep them secret, and the space shuttle became obsolete and rickety and got mothballed. So what has happened here is that there's this internal struggle that isn't talked about amongst the people who want to disclose these sciences and technologies and those who are hell-bent on keeping these secret for as long as they can, because when they come out, it means the end of oil, gas, coal, rockets, jet engines, internal combustion engines, centralized utilities, and, by the way, solar panels and windmills, which are, of course, windmills are from the 1800s or before then, actually. And the point being that the folks who are in the macroeconomic system who look at these things really always want to maintain the status quo because there are so many special, powerful interests that are in that domain. And so the scientific people who've dealt with these technologies who I've interviewed are appalled that these have not come out, but the reasons for it aren't technical. They're macroeconomic, geopolitical control. And that's what the public has to understand, and that's why the space shuttle, which, got pretty much put in use in 1980s, about 30 years ago, that one, I'm sure when that was coming online, there were people thinking, oh, well, these other things will come out soon. And so each decade comes and goes, and the people who are the folks driven by greed and power keep ruthlessly suppressing the release of these other technologies. Never mind we're destroying the environment of the world, and never mind we're in the Middle East with these wars over oil, which don't ever seem to end, and never mind that we have 40% of the population of Earth in such poverty that 40% of Earth's occupants do not even have plumbing, literally do not have a toilet to pee in. So what you find is that this is not a technical and scientific issue. That's been done and answered before, frankly, I was born. It's a social and macroeconomic and geopolitical problem. And this is what Eisenhower ran into in the late 50s when he was being stiff-armed out of the control of these projects. And this is why, if you look it up, Eisenhower, who was a five-star general, a military guy, a Republican, a conservative Republican, he basically said, look, in his last speech to the nation before he left office in January of 1961, just before John F. Kennedy took office, he said, beware the military-industrial complex. And the reason he said that was because he had lost control over this vast contractor world of moneyed interests that had kept these things secret, including the extraterrestrial part of it, but also and chiefly the science and technology part of it that would have at that time made ExxonMobil or whatever oil company obsolete and irrelevant. But that problem still exists in 2011. You have more people in the world using oil and gas and coal and little cars running around in China and India using petroleum than there were in 1960 or 1955. So the world is even more dependent on this poisonous, nasty stuff that's destroying the environment. And with that is an enormous amount of wealth and power. And it becomes more and more difficult. It's like this, George W. Bush himself called it this terminal addiction that we have to oil and fossil fuels. And that is really what's behind the fact that we ran out of the longevity of the space program and don't have anything to put in its place because, at a certain point, you can only take explosive rockets so far. You can't go that far with them. It takes forever to even get to Mars at that speed. Whereas with these other technologies, you probably get to Mars in a few minutes. So, because you're dealing with trans-dimensional technologies that can go beyond the speed of light. And I think that this is one of the big problems of where we are. Everyone thinks a lot of what the work we're doing is futuristic. I'm going, you know what? We're really just trying to catch the world up to where it could have been, it should have been around 1955 to 1960. And that everything since then has been sort of an arrested development. And that arrested development, which is very unnatural, has created these huge problems in the world in terms of poverty, environmental problems, Middle East entanglements where, let's face it, we're mainly in the Middle East because of oil. We're not there for any other reason. If it was just purely humanitarian reasons, we'd have 500,000 troops in countries in Africa or someplace. So we don't. And the reason we don't is because our concerns that when they say our national security interests in the Middle East, that's just code word for oil, basically. So I think that this is what has driven the policy behind what's happened with the space program. And the tragic thing is a lot of very good people with NASA and that people that my uncle worked with, they didn't have any control over these top secret technologies, and they had to do the best they could with what they were allowed to work with, which happened to be circa 1940s rocket technology.
Exactly. People, if you're listening to this for the first time, you kind of blink your eyes and say, well, this can't be true. I saw it on television or what have you. But I think I'd like to go back for a minute or so. And an example, I'm going to go through 3 or 4 examples quickly or just give you some flavor of it. The late Daniel Morris Salter, who dealt with UFOs and the technology, stated on the record with us, UFOs are both extraterrestrial and man-made.